Hello and welcome to PCB Chat, where we talk with experts across the printed circuit design, manufacturing, and electronic supply chain fields. I'm Mike Buteau, president of the PCEA. It's a chilly day here in New England, but we wish a warm good morning to today's guest, David Schild. David is executive director of the Printed Circuit Board Association of America, or the PCBAA. Its mission is to promote and support U.S. production of PCBs and their supply chain. Today, we're going to talk tax policy and what to expect on the legislation front from the incoming administration. David, so good to have you back here on PCB Chat.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Mike.
So you may have heard, I think I saw this in the papers, that the U.S. is going to have a new president in January. So let's jump right into it. No bearing the lead here. What do you anticipate the priorities of the incoming administration will be, and how do they align with the goals of PCBAA's members?
That's a great question. Everyone is trying to digest the impact of the 2024 elections. But what I would say is that what was true before the 2024 elections, both for the president, right, and the House and the Senate, is still true today. And that is that chips don't float. We need to invest in the entire microelectronics ecosystem. The issues, Mike, that underpin our drive and our mission haven't changed. Certainly the personalities and the political winds have shifted, have changed. And here's what we're looking at going into the 119th Congress. I think you're going to see a diminished appetite, let's say, for direct grant and support programs for industry writ large. I don't think you're going to see the Trump administration running towards something resembling a CHIPS program. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that Gina Raimondo and the team at the Commerce Department are moving very, very quickly to disperse CHIPS funds before that transition happens on January 20th, right? We're, a little more than 6 weeks away from the new administration. And I think that while the CHIPS fruits will continue to become evident for everyone and we'll continue to see the benefits, what's more likely from our perspective is tax reform, regulatory changes, trade policy that relies less on direct government intervention through grants and direct monies, and more a program that really looks at incentivizing U.S. production, reshoring, and leveling the playing field against our major competitors in this arena. So a lot of changes coming, but I'm optimistic that there are still avenues and opportunities to help our industry.
Do you think that the CHIPS Act could possibly follow along the lines of the Affordable Health Care Act, where the impact was felt throughout the economy to such extent that it became counterproductive, perhaps, for Congress to cut it, despite some of their public statements to the contrary?
So, Mike, my view of the CHIPS Act is kind of a bipartisan one, right? I'm not identifying it with President Biden or necessarily Democratic leadership politically. I think it's just a great piece of industrial policy, and you'll recall that it had broad bipartisan support. One of the most remarkable things about that program is not that it led to new factory construction in the way of semiconductor fabs in places like Ohio and places like Arizona. It's that it inspired private money to get off the sidelines. We talk very often about the contraction of manufacturing and why is it that Wall Street and the investment community doesn't want to put money into a new PCB factory, as an example. Well, it's because they don't see a demand signal. They don't see a customer. But in the case of the CHIPS Act, the $52 billion that the government invested was far eclipsed by more than $400 billion in private money that's come off the sidelines. That demand signal from Uncle Sam is really powerful.
So, we talk about the CHIPS Act, but of course, our section of the industry, our slice, is really more focused on the next layer in the stack, right, which is the board level and beyond. We have seen some investments for printed circuit board programs via the Defense Production Act Purchases Program. Calumet Electronics and Green Source, and I think TTM in New York may have benefited. I can't remember whether that was just a state grant or whether that was a DPAP.
Yeah, so really when you talk about government monies that have been deployed, the primary focus is that Defense Production Act and what we call the DPAI, or Defense Production Act Investment Account. 3 very high-profile awards within our industry are Green Source in New Hampshire, Calumet in Michigan, and TTM in Syracuse, New York. Now, you very correctly pointed out, Mike, that in some cases, state money actually was a partner to those federal funds. And you do see this across industrial policy and reshoring initiatives. Is it's not just federal government money that is often brought to the table, but it's state and local incentives as well. So while we are thrilled that the Pentagon chose to disperse those funds, as you know, every year we first have to fight to authorize the DPA monies. Then we have to get them appropriated. We still haven't passed, Mike, the fiscal year 25 defense appropriations bill. That's going to slip into the next Congress. Then we'll be waiting on the president's budget for fiscal year 26. It is incumbent upon our industry and PCBAA to make sure that that money is both allocated and then deployed. I'm thrilled that these 3 awards have occurred. It's not enough to reverse the trend that we've seen over the last 2 decades.
This may have been or may be about to be overcome by events, but do PCB companies need dedicated grant writers in order to win these awards? And if so, is this a service that PCBAA would actually contemplate offering?
I think you've been listening to our member calls, Mike. This is a very, very frequent topic of conversation because very often when you see a company get a large award, the follow-on question from their competimates is, how did that happen and how do I make it work for me? I will be the first one to say, Mike, doing business with the government is intimidating. It can be, a very challenging process, a very long road and complex maze that you have to navigate. However, I think the government is coming from a place of good motivation. Let's just put it that way. They want to support small, medium, and large businesses. They want to invest in critical technologies. And so here's what we're going to be doing, right, in the coming year. We need to connect those folks at the Pentagon, those folks at the Commerce Department, those folks at the Congress with industry directly so that we can have a conversation about what the process is. There is a fairly clear roadmap out there. Some of the companies that have followed it have had to be very patient to get those eventual awards. It's not a process that happens overnight by any means, but I do think it's worth taking that first step and taking the initiative. And to answer your question, yes, PCBAA has a role to play along with USPAE, along with IPC in putting together the policymakers who say, we've identified a supply chain shortfall and we want to fix it, and the companies that can actually solve the problem when government investment arrives.
David, what is the trickle-down effect on the supply chain? PCBAA has members across not just board fabricators, but also equipment providers, materials providers, assemblers, right? So what is being done to shore up their needs, right? Because it's one thing for a fabricator to get funding and we're going to put in new equipment, right? But now you have to source it from somewhere.
Sure.
And you have to have access not just to the equipment, but then also to enough applications engineers and so forth that, if something breaks or if you need a replacement for this and that, that's all, local enough that you can, keep your lines running. That has been something that over the last 20 plus years, we've seen really a hollowing out there, not just on the manufacturing side, but also all of the critical infrastructure that supports those manufacturers. Is there any sense that there are incentives, whether they're direct financial or otherwise, for those suppliers to invest in the U.S. Supply chain as well?
So, Mike, you make a great point that in order to get that final electronic product to market, there are so many different suppliers, so many different manufacturers, so many different assemblers and contractors that all have to work together, right? It's not as simple as saying TTM or Calumet or Green Source, and then all of a sudden we have an F-35 or we have a Javelin missile, right? It's obviously much more complex. I think the reason that PCBAA continues to attract folks across the ecosystem is the direct and the indirect benefits are fairly plain to see. So if you are an equipment manufacturer like Schmoll or Burkle, right, organizations that recently joined our association, you're supplying critical tooling. And so when a board shop does well, or when an assembler does well, a contract manufacturer does well, that's good for your business. I think that's why you've seen support from raw and refined materials companies. I think that's why you've seen more and more of the assembly community coming under our umbrella. The story here is about an ecosystem-wide benefit. Now, that may be an indirect benefit. My customer does well, and so I do well, as opposed to someone from the Pentagon is here with $10 million so that you can expand your footprint, right? It's a different story depending on how these grants, these programs get executed. But I think everybody sees up and down the supply chain that we're in this together. We're going to sink or swim as an industry ecosystem. And so that's why, if you're asking yourself, can I expect direct government investment? If the answer is no, you can potentially see many downstream benefits if your key customer, if your key supplier benefits from industrial policy that says, let's make it in America, let's have a secure and resilient supply chain.
Do you get a sense that your members see Ultra HDI as an opportunity to close the technology gap with Asia, provided, of course, that the investment capital is there?
Yeah, absolutely. We hear more and more people talking about HDI and UHDI, and of course, more and more interest from government agencies in how that technology can be deployed. We have long said, Mike, that we think that it's not enough to bring back legacy technologies, right, that have sort of been commoditized and gone overseas. I say this a lot, which is I don't know that dishwasher printed circuit boards or garage door opener printed circuit boards are coming back to the United States. But the boards that power electric vehicle chargers, the boards that power the banking system, the water and power grid, the boards that are a part of aerospace applications, we think there are strategic national security and economic security reasons to make those in the United States. We invented most of the microelectronics used around the world, but we no longer manufacture most of it. That doesn't have to be that way when it comes to the next generation of technologies. And I think you've seen through the CHIPS Act, through the Defense Production Act, the government is prioritizing next generation and leading edge technology investment. They're really not looking to bring back legacy technologies. We acknowledge the reality of that. And so, yeah, that's a long way of saying HDI and UHDI, I think, are going to be a part of the conversation going forward.
Do you have other specific priorities mapped out for the next 18 to 24 months?
Absolutely. So our near-term focus is on tax reform. I think, best opportunity we have ever had to get a tax policy that favors our industry is right now. There's a lot of talk on Capitol Hill about the need for a large tax reform package in the initial months of the Trump administration, when the Republicans will have control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. And so I know even right now, before the 119th Congress has been sworn in, there are meetings going on with the Joint Taxation Committee, the Congressional Budget Office, the Ways and Means staffers discussing what's possible. And we are already on Capitol Hill. I know that individual companies have been in this week. Our chairman, Shane Whiteside, and I are going to the Hill next week. When we come back from the Christmas break, there's going to be quite a large number of executives flying to Washington to work on these efforts directly. The tax component, as you know, was originally part of H.R. 3249, the Protecting Circuit Boards and Substrates Act. Our goal now is to pull out that tax provision, attach it to a larger tax package, and get that 25% credit on the purchase of American-made PCBs and substrates into law, into IRS code, and start allowing purchasers and manufacturers to take advantage of it as soon as possible.
In pursuit of that, are you going to be working with other organizations or associations, maybe even outside the traditional electronics space? When I think of tax reform, I'm not sure whether it's going to be specific to key NAICS codes or whether they're looking at something that's more of an omnibus nature.
So I think that the discussion right now is around using a tool called reconciliation, which is a way to speed revenue and tax bills through the Congress. I don't want to get into too much sausage making here for your audience, but I will just say that this is a joint effort. We are working hand in hand with IPC, which has also come out very, very strongly in favor of this tax provision. Between the two of us, we represent hundreds and hundreds of companies that would benefit from a provision like this, an incentive that would say, when you're looking at sourcing, when you're looking at where your microelectronics come from, consider the United States, choose the United States over some of our adversary nations, over some of our competitors across the sea, because now it doesn't just make sense from a strategic sourcing perspective, from a risk mitigation perspective, but it makes sense to your bottom line. That's what a tax credit would do. That's why we and IPC are spending so much time on this.
Are there any other areas that your membership is wanting you to concentrate on?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier that there is a hunger to learn more about the government investment process. How do Defense Production Act dollars get dispersed? How can we become more familiar with those sort of direct grant programs? There's a lot of interest in what the Commerce Department is going to do with the remainder of the CHIPS money and the CHIPS program writ large. Of course, we are also very interested in what is going to happen going forward on tariffs and how that might affect the industry. We'll be keeping a close eye on, what's been spoken about quite a bit by President-elect Trump is a desire to place tariffs on goods manufactured overseas, and how is that going to affect our industry? Every year, Mike, we've got a president's budget that's got to get submitted. We've got a congressional process that's supposed to take 6 to 8 months where that budget is marked up and adjusted. I will note that as we still try to get the FY25 money across the goal line, the president's budget for fiscal year 25 did not contain any money for microelectronics. And it was only through the combined efforts of PCBAA and IPC that money was restored. I am really proud of that victory. Now let's get that appropriation signed into law, and let's turn our sights towards fiscal year 26. This is going to be a recurring issue. Of course, on a longer timeline, we have the implementation of a rule at the Department of Defense that says that we've got to get dual use and COTS technologies from foreign and adversarial nations out of our defense supply chain. We have got a whole of government approach that says to the federal government, again, at large, where are you buying from? Where are you sourcing from? The challenges with a rule like the ITAR scheme is that it builds a very high fence around a very small yard in terms of defense technologies. But when you back up for a second and say, what else is critical? What else do we rely on? What else powers the modern world? And does any of it come from a place of dependency on, quite frankly, our adversaries and competitors? There are some very tough answers to that question. And so PCBA is trying to push folks in, the Homeland Security community, the critical infrastructure community, to consider a little bit more broadly, how are we keeping the lights on? How are we keeping Wall Street running? What's powering medical devices? Where is that technology coming from? And is it a good idea to depend on one adversarial nation for most of it? I think the answer is no. That's going to be a large and long-term conversation that we have to have in Washington.
I couldn't agree with you more about that, David. The number of hacks that we've seen, and I know that that's seen as a software issue more than a hardware issue, but there's no question that materials and equipment can be sabotaged as well. And ultimately, it's the breakdown of those materials and equipment that then cause the problems in the public and private sector, right? So, we have the electrical grid as a perfect example. And I'm sure there's been plenty of talk in some of the policymaking bodies about what that network should look like, but those things aren't necessarily being communicated out. And to our industry's point, we have no way of planning and building around or building for an infrastructure that we're not fully clear on what the vision is for. So if, for example, we want to have a disconnected electrical grid where you have lots of discrete operations as opposed to one giant national one. The discrete ones would be much harder to penetrate. If you take down one, you're not taking down the whole grid. But there's also the maintenance and the upkeep and the standardization and all the rest of that. The interaction right between government and industry, to my knowledge, hasn't taken place. And that's just one example. You mentioned Wall Street. I think medical all the time because we're in Boston. That's a medical mecca. A lot of companies here are built around supplying to that end market, and that's the second largest end market in the country. So these things are all critical infrastructure.
Well, I appreciate that, Mike. And look, we dug ourselves into this hole over 3 decades. We're not going to dig ourselves out in 3 weeks or 3 months, but the important part is to begin. And I do think that smart and concerned people, both in industry and government, the fact that we're having these conversations is an important first step. Now we need to move forward to specific legislative and policy outcomes. And it causes me to say this, to you and your audience, we cannot afford to sit still. And I say that because I'm also looking at what other nations are doing around the world. You hear a lot about this China plus one strategy, a desire to perhaps get manufacturing out of mainland China. And who do you see acting very swiftly to capture a lot of that business, right? The Philippine government, the Vietnamese government, the Thai government, investments, speeding construction, permitting, creating an incredibly friendly business environment because they see, let's call it a flight from China, and they are taking advantage of that. The Spanish, those in the UK, they're doing chips-like investments. We're seeing efforts by the Dominican Republic, by Chile to make investments as well. The US cannot afford to sit still on industrial policy. If we think that leaving an adversarial location necessarily means that business and manufacturing has to come to the United States, I think that's naive. We have to be competitive on industrial policy. We have to understand that peer and allied nations also see this opportunity and they're moving out. So it's no time to sit still.
Is PCBAA taking a position on any of the H-1B workers? There's been an issue, really going back even to the recession point in 2007, 2008, when unemployment spiked to 7, maybe 8%. We still hear over and over again how difficult it is to find workers for manufacturing, shop floor activity, and so forth. We depend a lot on being able to supplement the domestic workforce with folks from the outside. What, if anything, is PCBAA thinking in terms of how to support its members in so far as making sure that those the staffing levels are optimized?
Mike, you've hit on an issue that doesn't just affect the printed circuit board industry, but U.S. manufacturing across the board. There is a shortage of talented manufacturing workers and professionals available for those who want to expand their operations. Everybody, semiconductor manufacturers, raw materials suppliers, tooling and equipment manufacturers, board shops. We hear this from everybody that there is a workforce challenge. Fortunately, these are fields where, as you know, you can have a long and successful career. You can go to work in microelectronics and stay there for decades. And so we see a little bit of an older workforce that obviously offers its own areas of concern. But when we're asked about this on Capitol Hill, I say we are in favor of investments and efforts that will create a domestic workforce supply chain, if you will. I've said this before. When you look at what the CHIPS Act has done, it is not a coincidence that Ohio State University was part of the conversation in Ohio. Arizona State and Arizona University were part of the conversation outside of Phoenix. These are higher educational institutions that are asking themselves, can we create an educational program, a curricula that eventually produces the next generation of semiconductor engineers, manufacturers, plant managers, et cetera? We need a similar focus. And I know a number of our members have great internship programs, are partnered with local universities. But I think you could talk to anybody doing manufacturing in the United States, especially in high-tech manufacturing, and they would say, I'm concerned that over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, we are not going to be able to meet the demand if we truly reshore this work. So we're not going it alone in this argument. I think PCBAA is going to be part of a much larger coalition that's going to say, look, once Congress creates the incentives and allocates the funds to build out the factories and fill them up with equipment, the next thing to do is fill them up with workers. That's not an easy problem to solve, but it's something that we can't wait to tackle. So I think our position, if you will, would be that yes, we need at the federal government level, at the state level, significant investments and focus on producing a high-tech workforce.
Do you think that the motivation is there within Washington and even at the state level to make that happen, right? Because what we usually get down to when we talk about building up a workforce in a particular area is, of course, finding the funds to help educate and train people for that particular sector.
I think that yes, the environment right now is not going to be as lucrative for direct government investment. However, here's the issue that I think remains bipartisan. We're in a globally competitive environment when it comes to industrial policy. If the US doesn't act, and workforce is part of this, direct investment is part of this, tax credits are part of this, we will get left behind. There are plenty of folks in Congress that want to be fiscally conservative. I'm not going to fault them for that viewpoint. They also do not want to lose the global competition to invent and manufacture the future. And so when you talk about where the government does spend money, where the government is going to give out tax incentives, I think strategic priorities aligning with economic priorities makes sense. Fortunately, microelectronics falls into that nexus, but it's going to be challenging, probably now more so than 36 months ago, to get direct investment in any of these kinds of programs. I think we're heading into, potentially a different environment with the direct grant programs. But again, I'm more optimistic about tax reform, and that's why our efforts are going to be focused there over the next 3 to 6 months.
Has there been discussion within PCBAA about other strategies you can take beyond direct investment to educate and encourage next gen workers that industrial manufacturing and specifically electronics is a viable career? For instance, simply just going into local colleges, junior colleges, and even to high schools to show kids what this industry really is, right? I mean, I do that a little bit in my municipality, but that's 20 kids a year. It's not a big dent that I'm making, right? But then if you multiply me by several hundred, well, then all of a sudden we're reaching lots and lots of people, and we can do that for free, right? It's just sort of open the eyes of the next generation to hardware design and manufacturing as being a viable and potentially lucrative career.
I'm really proud, Mike, of what a lot of our members are doing right now by engaging local educational institutions, by creating internship and apprentice programs. And that is, block by block, district by district, factory by factory, the work that's being done. I think longer term, yes, we need some sort of more formalized program. You hear discussions about this at the Commerce Department about the need to train an electronics writ large workforce. I don't think some of those efforts are close to being real today, but the issue really came to the forefront during the debate over the CHIPS Act, because there were a lot of smart folks, economists and others, who said, okay, these factories are going to take 2 to 3 years to build. I'm not sure we're going to have workers to fill them 36 months from now. So fortunately, it's not a conversation that we had to initiate, but it's a conversation that, we're going to have to continue and be part of. And again, what our local manufacturers are doing right now, specific to their sites, is a great initiative. We need a broader federal program to be sure.
Finally, David, there's been talk for the past 2 years or so about creating a dedicated facility for developing next-gen technologies and training the workforce on the same. What if, and this is specific to PCB, right? What, if anything, is PCBA's role in all that?
The initiative that you're referring to is really, sort of a quasi public-private partnership. It's led much more by the team at the United States Partnership for Assured Electronics, and I know a number of our members are part of it. We are really, Mike, an education, advocacy, and legislative outcome-based organization, right? We go to Washington and fight on behalf of our manufacturers. When it comes to these sorts of opportunities, like you're discussing, a next generation manufacturing facility that has both government funding and buy-in from industry, there are groups, again, out of the Pentagon and adjacent to our efforts that are leading in that space. And we highly encourage those sorts of partnerships. What they can't do very often is public education and public advocacy. That's our role. I think that's the niche that we have carved out here. And so, we're running in parallel, I think, in terms of our efforts to support the industry.
Well, David, before we wrap up here and go run out, finish your Christmas shopping or whatever other holiday shopping you need to do, anything else you want to mention before we close out?
No, Mike, I want to thank all of your listeners, and especially those that have chosen to join our association this year. We've gone from 5 to 65 members in a remarkably short period of time. I think we're on our way to a much larger coalition, and every week I am hearing from folks who are saying, we need someone fighting for us in Washington. We want to be part of this effort, and they are across the entire ecosystem. So if you're listening to this podcast, if you're out there thinking, is there a way that my business, my organization can be a part of this effort in DC? We want to talk to you about how to make that possible. There's a very good chance that your customers, your suppliers, your business partners are already on the team. Please join us and let's go win change for the PCB industry in Washington.
Well, David, congratulations on all your work to date. I know that you and your team, Shane Whiteside and the other executive members, have all put in a lot into this effort. I want to remind folks that our guest today has been David Schild. He's the executive director of the Printed Circuit Board Association of America. The website is PCBAA.org. Happy holidays and good luck in Washington this coming year, David.
Thank you, Mike.
For PCB Chat, this is Mike Buteau. Have a nice day.